Okay, chapter 26, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. The Great Depression really almost broke America. And it certainly changed the relationship between Americans and their government. The 1920s had been, gosh, they've been great. We had won World War One. Our economy was strong, and people were working. This era was called the Roaring Twenties, absolutely for a reason. Um, and everybody was there to have a good time. Everybody assumed that these good times would simply continue. But there's a cost to this incredible production, and really no one saw it coming. The number of cars that we could make in a year were fantastic, but really it began to exceed the number of people who needed to buy a car every year. Eventually, customers didn't buy new goods and products for sale, and those products backed up. With that, the stage is really, it's going to be set for trouble. Well, nobody sees this coming is the problem. As a matter of fact, things appeared to be fine. In the 1920s, you had incredible wealth, and it had really concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer Americans. Those people wanted more money, and they used their money to make more money by investing in the stock market. And as a matter of fact, they really invested heavily. But as customers began to slow down because people weren't buying new goods, purchasing really kind of slowed. The value of many companies really began to drop, and so did the price of their stock. This is a real clue that investors look for. As the price drops in a company, an investor thinks, if an investor thinks that company still has a good promising future, it becomes a great stock to buy. If the price is low and you believe it will rise, you stand to make a great profit if you go ahead and buy that company. And many investors began to invest more and more heavily into the stock market because they started to think that they were seeing companies that still had great value really start to drop in price. To make buying stocks even more appealing, people could buy on something called margin. And buying on margins, actually, it's a big thing. You got to understand what it is. Margin, M-A-R-G-I-N. Really, it's kind of like using a credit card. You pay a little at first, and you pay a little as you go. In return, you get a lot of stuff. And that's kind of how it is. Let me see if I can explain it to you. If you're going to buy on margin, the first thing you're going to need is a stockbroker. This stockbroker will be able to sell you stock in a given company. And let's say the stock you're going to buy is $100 a share. Okay. But if you're going to be buying it on margin, all you need to do is pay $10 down, and the other $90 of this thing is going to be bought on margin. So if you're the guy that has the money and you want to come in and buy it, all you need to do is have some of the money. All you need is 10%. And if you've got that money, that's what you put down. The stockbroker then purchases the entire stock. The plan is, if the value of that stock rises, you'll get your money back when you sell the stock down the road. But that means that the value of the stock has to go up to the beyond the $90 that you still owe, and then go up more so that you can take the $90 that you owe, pay your broker back. Anything over and above that is the money you make. Well, for a long time in the 20s, this was actually working. The value of stocks was rising so high, people could buy on margin. When they chose to sell, they paid their broker. The value of the stock that they owed the broker was taken care of, and there was money left over. And so this seemed like exactly the kind of thing that people wanted to do. So a lot of people are running out, trying desperately to buy as many stocks as they can on margin. Now, the trick is, if you're going to buy a stock on margin, you need to be able to get your hands on a lot of money. And so people turn to where money was naturally sitting. They turn to big companies. A company like Standard Oil or U.S. Steel or some of these major corporations that we've been talking about actually found themselves in the loan business. And what they would do is they would loan out some of their profits at interest to investors who wanted to invest in the stock market. Those loans would then be made, and the customer comes in, takes the money, uses that money, and runs immediately as fast as he can over to his broker, and there you go. And now all of a sudden, there's great amount of wealth being pushed into the stock market. Now, for a long time, this works and everything's fine. What you're looking at here is a graph of the stock market, the Dow Jones, which is a measurement of how well the stock market is doing. On the top, on the left, you have a point value. The trick is you want that number to keep going up. Down on the bottom part of the graph, you have years. And all throughout the 20s, the stock market is going up. And if you're investing in the stock market, you're going to make money. Sure, there's some downturns, but the overall trend is absolutely, it is going up. And everybody assumed that it would always continue to go up. By 1929, buying stocks on the market had grown like crazy, and the future of the American economy absolutely looked great. As a matter of fact, in the summer of 1929, the Wall Street Journal itself wrote about investing in the stock market. The outlook for the fall months seems brighter than at any time before. And then it all changed. This right here is a chart that's going to show really what's going to end up being the big problem. It's going to be the unemployment rate that's going to be happening in America. You've got the years of population, the labor force. Really what you're looking at is the red over there, the percent of the labor force. What this is going to show you is that through the Great Depression, the percentage of people who could not find a job was unbelievably high. The red number, that's the percentage of unemployed people. So in 1929, there were 3.14% of Americans couldn't find a job. By 1932, that number had grown to 23.53% of Americans who couldn't find a job. It's all it's all tied in with the stock market crash that we're going to be getting to here in just a second. On October 24th, 1929, a date that became known as Black Thursday, the rise in stock prices really faltered, and that frightened investors and immediately began to sell off their stocks. There was, again, here what we're looking at, let me go back and explain it to you here. Again, you got the Dow Jones, which is a mark about how well the stock market is doing. You want that number high, really high. You got the years down at the bottom. And so through the 20s, if you look over on this graph, you can see that the stocks are generally rising. Sure, there's a few downturns, but for the most part, they're definitely going up. You had right up at the very peak of the thing in 1929, you see a small drop off. The market kind of had a problem, and all of a sudden the value of stocks dropped. And everybody got scared and nervous and tried to begin selling some stocks. But then it kind of settled down. People thought, okay, well, it was just another burp. It's not a big deal. Black Tuesday is that cliff that you look at right in the center. That's one day. And in that one day, frightened investors immediately began selling off their stocks for reasons that we're going to be discussing a lot more in class. So if you're listening to this before we get to the PowerPoint, understand that there's a lot more discussion about what happens here in class. And with that, the value of all stocks really starts to drop because people are going to get nervous and everybody's going to try and sell their stocks. As more people try and sell their stocks, more people get nervous. As more people get nervous, they sell their stocks, which puts a lot of stocks out on the market. And anytime you have a flood of any given product, the value of that product drops because there's a lot to buy. At the end of the day, we ended up losing huge amounts of money. It's really all you need to know here for reasons, again, that we're going to be able to get into in class. Some major companies in America are going to see the value of their stocks absolutely cut in half on a single day. Now, the effect of the country was a lot of things. Businesses are certainly going to close their doors. Great amounts of wealth are going to be gone. People are going to find out that buying on margin had propped up the economy, really in large part just on a bubble. But one of the things that's really going to hit a lot of Americans is the banks are going to close. And again, we're really going to get into the significance of closing banks and the role that banks play in the overall economy of America. We kind of got into that before when we were talking about Alexander Hamilton and his first Bank of the United States and the role he thought it was going to play. And we talked about when Andrew Jackson closed down the Bank of the United States and he launched a great big depression in 1837. Now we're into another one where, again, the banks are going to be directly affected. In 2008, when the stock market, again, when our economy was in big trouble, the banks were a big part of it because the banks are so central to our entire economy. But again, for a lot of the banks we're going to get into in class, and I've got a lot of facts and figures that we're going to get into there. But really what's going to happen is that banks, they're going to be desperate to hang on to the money that they've got, so they're not going to want to loan it out. And with that, money is going to stop flowing. Consumers and businesses and people that use that money and kind of keep it moving are really going to run into a problem, and lo and behold, everything gets bad. It will lead to fewer customers. That will lead to fewer sales. That will lead to increased layoffs, and that's going to will become a very, very vicious cycle. In this, the stock market crash, the collapse of American business led to a high of an unemployment rate of 25% as production everywhere drops. Now, there's going to, in response to this, President Roosevelt he's going to come in and he's going to act. This is the Emergency Banking Relief Act, and go ahead and write this down. This is something that we are going to cover some, but it's kind of how he's going to come in and try and shore up faith in the banks so that the economy can move, so that the economy has some kind of a chance. And so again, something we're going to be getting into in class. But please write this down. But basically, that's the economy at this point in time. It's crashing and burning, and things are very much bad. And there's a lot of reasons why the crash happened, and the role it all certainly plays. One, for example, one part of it, companies were certainly producing more than their customers could buy. You had some unstable economic conditions in Europe at this point in time. You had a lot of corporate mismanagement that simply led into what was happening. You had a lot of problems with buying on margin. And people just really, really heavily investing and taking wild gambles on the stock market because they only had to come up with 10% of the money anyway. And really and truly, it was too much wealth concentrated in the hands of a few people who they themselves had really invested heavily in the stock market. But at the end of the day, it caught up with everybody. And when it did, the economy absolutely crashed. Now, when it did, the effects of the Great Depression were terrible. The material hardships that everybody went through were bad enough, but the emotional hardships were really, really devastating, as millions of Americans who had actually done nothing wrong now found themselves unable to support their families. And then again, with nowhere to turn for help because everybody was in trouble. There really was no end in sight. As people, it wasn't that people didn't want to work, people were desperate to work. There were just no jobs to be found. And in a time with no public assistance, it got really, really difficult, and it was not good. You would get unemployed men and women standing in line for absolutely hours waiting for any kind of assistance. Veterans would sell apples or pencils on street corners. People left the country for the city looking for work, and people left the city for the country looking for work. And the problem was, it really wasn't there. This right here kind of became the iconic photograph, really kind of describing the Great Depression and what is going on. Her story is really quite powerful. She's 32 years old and she has 6 children. You can see her youngest child in her arms right there. She had come and driven her family from the Midwest. She was heading out to California hoping for a new opportunity. Her husband had died of tuberculosis 5 years earlier. So really, it's this mother and 6 kids making their way to California hoping for something better. And as they're headed to across the country, their car broke down. And she kind of is sitting right next to that car on the side of the road next to a pea farm. That's sitting there when she was discovered by a photographer who took this photograph. And it's the look on her face as she's now trapped in the middle of nowhere with 6 kids that she's got to figure out how to feed and how to care for. One of them truly an infant. She had, as a matter of fact, just before this photograph was taken, had just sold the tires of her car for food that she could feed her kids. And so really, she's stuck. The car is broken and now it has no tires, and here she is And this really was the Great Depression. And this is that emotional state that really truly hit everybody in the Depression. This sense that they had done nothing wrong. These are people who had worked hard their entire lives. These are people. This is a woman of the field who truly, I mean, is perfectly willing to do whatever work there is to keep her family going. And there's just no work. It's just there's not there. And with 25% of the population out of work, and the other 75% not necessarily getting full-time hours, and certainly not feeling that they're going to be able to keep their jobs. Great concern. And really the look on her face, it's why it's an iconic photograph, is that it really truly, her story sums up the entire Great Depression, everything that's going on out there, and just people trying to figure out how they're going to get through this, just this day, let alone tomorrow. Just the day. How's she going to keep these kids fed? How are she going to keep these kids going? Now, with everything that's kind of like happening, you've got problems everywhere, and it's hitting her. Obviously, it's hitting all the workers. It's hitting minorities hard. African Americans who come north in the Great Migration, they quickly found themselves out of work, and usually the first to be laid off from any kind of a job. You got the middle class was hit very, very hard. Is all of a sudden in these incredible, difficult financial times, their specific set of job skills really wasn't necessary. And the middle class, really, they found themselves quickly unable to pay their mortgage, unable to pay their rent, outside, simply trying to find something, trying to find work with a set of job skills that didn't really apply to what's going on in the world anymore. Nobody needs an accountant. Nobody needs a teacher. Nobody needs a middle management guy for a factory anymore. It's just, they were very, very hard hit. And many simply walked away from their past lives. Many men, a lot of boys, even some women, simply hopped on trains, going wherever the train was going, figuring that anywhere else is better than where they were. And when they got there, they got off the train and they looked for work. Generally found that there wasn't any work and got on the next train going wherever it was going. Hopeful that something was better somewhere else. And they rarely found it. As if all this wasn't bad enough, for, again, reasons we're going to get into in class, over farming had created a terrible situation in the real agricultural states, that the topsoil was loosened, and a huge drought and a huge series of circumstances came rolling in. And really what's going to end up happening, is if things weren't bad enough, is that the drought will create a condition where the great topsoil found throughout this area colored in on this map is going to take the very dirt itself and simply blow it up into the sky, and what becomes known as a series of dust storms, or the Dust Bowl. And gigantic walls of dust, 30, 40, 50 miles wide, would sweep across state after state after state, covering everything in just incredible thick clouds of dust that, like I said, honestly, would blow for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so if you were, with that drought, actually able to start to get something to begin growing, a dust storm would simply come rolling in and cover it with 6 inches of dirt. And then all your plants are choked off from everything else. And there you go. You're out of luck. And with that, people would simply pack up, leave those states, and go somewhere else. It's in large part, it's what happened to the migrant mother that we were taking a look at a few minutes ago. The dust storm simply driving them out of these regions. The problem was, those are the regions where we're growing the food. And those are the regions that people are depending on to feed the country. And so when everything is bad, and there are no jobs, and there is no hope, and businesses are closing down, now the agricultural center of the nation is hit hard with these incredible dust storms, because why wouldn't it happen during the Great Depression is really kind of it. If it could go bad, it certainly did. The public going for someone to blame. They're going to point their fingers, and President Hoover was the man who's going to take the blame. Now, Hoover had really built a strong background in economics, and truly knew what he was talking about when it came to economics. But the problem was he was absolutely a believer that things would simply turn around. Things are going to get better. We're going through a tough time. If we can get through it, we can knuckle down, we can make our way through this, and we will be fine. We will be fine. And that message worked for a little while. But then very, very quickly, Americans simply saw Hoover as simply being helpless and unable to deal with the problems at hand. As Herbert Hoover more and more and more took the blame for the Great Depression and what was going on in people's lives. And then especially, like I said, this feeling, this message that he had that things will get better, things will get better. And Hoover, as a trained economist, he had good reasons to think that. Let's take a look kind of what's behind his thought. Now, you don't write any of this next section down. You quickly summarize kind of what I say to justify what Hoover is thinking. But if you go back through our nation's history, in 1797, we had our first economic crisis as a result of land speculation and some harassment from the Bank of England. They were still mad over the revolution. And so we had a big economic crisis, and we got through it. In 1807, we had another crisis from another trade agreement from England, and we got through it. In 1815, paying for the War of 1812 caused a crisis. In 1837, as a result of land speculation and President Jackson closing the Bank of the United States, and we got through both of those. In 1857, we had a crisis. In 1873, we had another crisis when the railroads almost collapsed. As a matter of fact, the economic crisis of 1873, 18,000 businesses collapsed and unemployment hit 14%, and we got through it. In 1893, another big economic crisis, again, centered on railroads, hit. Another 15,000 businesses went out. Unemployment was over 10% for 5 years. It was an absolutely terrible time, and we got through it. In 1907 and 1920, each terrible economic crises, in which in each and every one, the American economy had eventually corrected itself. We got through it. A trained economist like Hoover looked at what was happening and absolutely thought we were in this pattern again. And given every time he looked at it, that figured, this is it. This is the pattern. We're going to get through it. Things will be fine. He honestly believed that if America just kind of like stayed calm, that the situation would turn around like it always had before. 1929 was different. 1929 was bigger. 1929 went deeper. It affected more people. It affected more jobs. It impacted more things. 1929 wasn't any of those other depressions. And the message that Hoover had simply, it wasn't working. And he did, in fact, try a few things. He actually tried more than he gets credit for. But really, it was all too little. It was all too late. It really just didn't have much effect. And more, everybody turned and blamed him specifically for the entire depression. And then in 1932, it was time for a new election. Overwhelmingly, the nation left Herbert Hoover and supported a multimillionaire whose family was not affected by the Depression at all. This multimillionaire had some really closely guarded secrets. He was a Democrat who related to a Republican president that the nation earlier had absolutely loved. This New York politician had already served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, although his only experience on water was sailing his own private yachts around the coast of New York, when he had others do the hard work of raising and lowering the sails because he simply liked, driving the boat. He was a victim of polio that caused him to be unable to walk without the assistance of large leg braces and a large man to balance himself on, and usually had to remain in a wheelchair. But Franklin Roosevelt was exactly what the nation needed. And he had exactly the right attitude. He knew exactly what was coming and how to fix the problem. He had a belief that our problems were in fact manageable, and were all something that one day we would overcome. And he had the same kind of message there that Hoover had, but he just had a better way of saying it. Roosevelt saw the problems of the Great Depression were really centered around three things: banks, jobs, and farmers. And Roosevelt's going to go about actually trying to bring about help for all of those. As you take a look at this, the problem with the country is that with the banks, with the jobs, with everything that's happening there, as jobs go, cuts in production lead to layoffs. That leads to unemployment, which means fewer customers. If you look at the bottom, as the arrows turn back up, things are going to begin to grow worse, which leads to fewer customers spending more money, forcing more businesses to cut more production, and more cuts of production lead to more layoffs. More layoffs leads to fewer customers. Fewer customers makes the economy worse, which leads more businesses to slow itself down. This is what Roosevelt is dealing with. Now, the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt was different than Hoover. And though it wasn't entirely true, Hoover wasn't seen as sitting helplessly in the White House while the events of the Depression overtook the nation. When he was sworn in as the 33rd president of the United States, the nation's economy was really on the brink of collapse. 13 million Americans could not find a job. The unemployment rate was at 25%. Banks were closed in 38 of the 48 states, not a bank to be found. On the morning of his inauguration, the governors of New York and Illinois closed the banks in New York City and Chicago, bringing the country's financial transactions to a halt in its two largest cities. In the face of all this, on his inauguration speech, Franklin Roosevelt looked the country right figuratively in the eye and announced, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He then asked for and was granted broad authority to act in the face of this mounting crisis. Within 10 days, he acted and saved the nation's banking system. He closed every remaining bank in the nation, sent accountants in to look at the books, and if the bank was good, it was reopened and the deposits inside were insured. If the accountants couldn't vouch that the bank would stay open in the near future, they took the deposited money and transferred it to a secure bank and closed the bad bank down. Okay, we actually got to the side a little bit before. This is the Emergency Banking Relief Act. We actually talked about this just a little bit before. He then went on the radio and announced to the nation that the banks are going to reopen the next day. And that the banks that would reopen, that the government guaranteed that your deposits in them were safe, because that meant that the business of government could continue and the business of the economy could begin growing. And then he finished his speech and then sat nervously in the White House, kind of waiting to see how it would be received by the entire nation. The next day, after being closed for 10 days, giving customers no access to their money at all, Americans deposited more money in banks than they withdrew. With that, the banking crisis was over, and people had faith in the banks again, and Roosevelt had a way to begin fixing the rest of the economy. For the next 3 months, there would be a flurry of action as Roosevelt sent 15 pieces of legislation designed to attack the Great Depression. All 15 were approved by Congress, and all of them were enacted. This is called the 100 Days. It became known as a time of rapid legislative action by Roosevelt just to get the country back on its feet again. Not all of it worked. Not all of it ended up being legal, and the Supreme Court was going to throw several pieces of it out as being illegal. But it's what America needs. You got a president taking actual steps, getting involved, trying desperately to help them. One of the first big things that we want to get into is called the Tennessee Valley Authority. Please write this down. The Tennessee Valley Authority, called the TVA, program building dams and operating electric power plants, bringing electricity into some of the nation's poorest areas. Into the 1930s, there was very, very little electricity in most of these places. Now, what you're looking here, obviously, is a map of the state of Kentucky, Tennessee, and the northern part of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas. The blue area is the Tennessee Valley. You can see on there the white parts inside that blue map. Those are lakes and rivers, and that's what he dammed up. And the dams are all the little black things on there that they kind of look in there. They kind of look like beans or something like that on this map. But that's where the electricity was generated. What he did is he goes in and by building these, one, he creates jobs. which puts money back into this economy. The federal government takes the responsibility to hire the people, provide them with the equipment, and put them to work building these dams. The dams, as it turns out, brings electricity into the area. So on the one hand, he helps with the economy. On the other hand, he brings something that this area very, very much needs. In the 1930s, they didn't have electricity. Okay. This is a big part of it. It's about jobs. It's about putting people back to work. And these jobs programs are going to be building infrastructure, paying a good wages and a good salary, and sending people off to job sites and works around the country, getting money moving again, putting people back to work, and giving the nation a sense that everything was going to be all right. Farmers are going to be helped too. Again, please write this down. Farmers desperate to try and make their payments had planted as much as they could. The problem was there was overproduction of crops, and the value of everything they were trying to sell was low because there was a lot of it out there. And so he's actually going to encourage farmers to plow up their fields and ruin their crops. At a time of possible starvation, he's going to convince people to go ahead and do that. The idea being that smaller crop out there to buy is going to drive up the price, which means the farmers will actually have an opportunity to make their payments, to be able to pay their mortgages and do what they needed to do. This one will actually be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It's a big one because it shows the lengths that he's willing to go to, and it shows that he's trying to help farmers specifically. It's also important, as we're going to get to later, because the Supreme Court is going to throw it out. There's a reason that that's in there. We're going to be getting to it here in a bit. The Civilian Conservation Corps, please write this down. Unemployed unmarried men going to work. They keep $1 a day, but $25 a month heads back home. It's going to help the economy where the men physically are at, because they've got a little bit of money to spend themselves, and then the money being sent back home to help support their parents and brothers and sisters, because again, these are unmarried men. It helps support families back home and put money into the economy in two different places. The Works Progress Administration was another one. Jobs to men and women, building bridges, roads, and airport. These are more married men, but again, money is being split. The fathers, the husbands, the men with family responsibilities, they don't have their families with them. They're getting a small part of their check. Food and a place to sleep, all that's provided for them. So they don't need the money for anything more than just buying supplies and maybe, having a little bit of fun. But the majority of the paycheck goes back home. So mom and their children, wherever they are, have cash coming in. The kids can be fed. The kids can have clothes. Money is moving in two different areas of the economy. This is kind of a big part of his job. Basically, the idea to use federal money just to build things around the country and get people working. Trees are planted, bridges are built, roads are paved. Eventually, 2 million men, for example, are going to go to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps, helping get their families back on their feet. It wasn't important what these people were doing. What they were building, or what was important, was that they were working, and that money was being put back into the economy, as once again people are being turned back into consumers. And this is going to allow small businesses that could support the workers to reopen and hire workers and get the economy turned around. Married men and men with families to support, like I say, pay is split. You can't bring your family with them, so it's going to help everywhere. Because the problem isn't that people don't want to work. They're desperate to work. The problem is there aren't jobs. The government fundamentally changes its entire role with average Americans, working class Americans, because the government now takes responsibility for putting these people to work. It takes huge swaths of the population that it had never concerned itself with before, takes responsibility for their survival and creates jobs and finds a way to pay them for their labor to simply go out and work. The fundamental role of the government is completely reinvented by Franklin Roosevelt at this point in time. The government had never before been a large employer. Some people had worked for the government, but it had always been small numbers. Now, millions of Americans are employed directly by these programs, being paid by the government to do work for the government, depending on the government itself for their salary, as the government takes responsibility for people being workers. This had never happened before. Before, if you were out of work, you had to go find yourself a job. If you didn't, You could just make your way out and go farming. You could do something. I mean, there was always work on a farm that you could do, but now nobody's hiring. That opportunity wasn't there, and it took the government to step in and change that. If you get a question on the New Deal about this, the biggest thing to remember is that the government is assuming responsibility for putting people to work and helping people in this time of need. That had never been done before. For that, Franklin Roosevelt was loved by the people of the United States. At least by many, but not by all. There's a couple of people that might come up as groups who did not like Roosevelt and what he was trying to do. Father Coughlin is one. Please write that down. A harsh critic of the New Deal. Dr. Francis Townsend, again, a big critic of the New Deal, who made a lot of noise. Actually, his big impact was Roosevelt took a very toned down version of what his big idea was and turns it into Social Security, which is still a fundamental role of government today. And then Senator Huey Long, who really kind of came out with some aggressive ideas as far as taking from the rich and absolutely giving that money to the poor and redistributing wealth in a really extreme kind of a way. The biggest part of the New Deal that's still with us today, as a matter of fact, is Social Security. This is a big one. You got to definitely write this down. Social Security in itself is the idea that the work that's being done in America at this time, it's a lot of physical labor. It's a lot of labor like the people that you're looking at here, they simply cannot do. And so the government will begin to provide for them and just send them a check for work that they have basically done in the past, to take care of the elderly, to make sure that they are fed, because the money that they're getting, they're going to spend on food. They're going to spend on things that they need. Again, money is being moved into the economy to create economic growth, to get things moving, to get things kind of spinning around again and pick up some traction. And it's about just kind of making sure that the people of retirement age are taken care of. I finally got one more big key act that's going to come out of the New Deal. It's called the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act, what it's going to do, now that people are starting to work again, things get important. And it's really going to strengthen the rights of unions to come in and protect workers. And this is what's really going to begin breaking all those laissez-faire policies that we've talked about before. And with that, the power of the unions are really going to begin to grow. As a matter of fact, John Rockefeller's company, U.S. Steel, will immediately begin negotiating with the union because of the Wagner Act, giving employees increased pay and increased benefits, which is going to be a powerful thing. General Motors will try and fight the union for a while, but quickly they're going to lose and give in. These increased wages and benefits gained by this group of workers is really going to increase and grow the middle class. This growth in the middle class is going to become the backbone of the American economy, at least up until the 1970s, when yet another economic problem is going to come in and really kind of hit the middle class really hard. But it's certainly going to be a big thing. Now, when it comes to minorities, the New Deal didn't really deliver as well as it could have. At times during the Depression, things had gotten worse for African Americans. There was an old saying about African Americans and companies: last hired, first fired. And that definitely proved all too true. And as African American workers were laid off a lot. If the national unemployment rate was 25% for urban African Americans, the unemployment rate was actually 50%, because again, last hired, first fired. And so they were unbelievably hit harder by the impact of the Great Depression. There were some programs in some areas that did help Black workers in southern states, in all states actually, but in southern states, a lot of those programs, Black workers actually received less government assistance or less government pay for the work that they were doing than white workers. You've still got these issues of segregation. You've still got these same problems that of race that have been dealt with for a long time, as people just, they're not paying African workers the same, African American workers the same amount of money they're paying white workers. And there's a lot of reasons that Roosevelt didn't do more for minorities. One was a belief that the problem problems that he's dealing with are so big that you got to go out there and just fix what you can first, and then go back and fine tune some details. And so, if millions and millions of Americans are out of work, you got to start getting millions back to work, and then fine tune all the different ethnic groups and racial groups to make sure that everybody's helped. And another big part is that for the New Deal, he needs support from Southern congressmen and senators to pass and fund the New Deal, and he would lose all their support the instant he insisted that African Americans be treated equally, or there be some civil rights in this thing. That he cannot do what he needs to do if he insists strongly that civil rights are a big part of it. Despite all of this, however, African American voters are going to rally to Roosevelt. Now, since the Civil War, African American voters had supported the Republican Party because Abraham Lincoln, who had worked so hard to free them from slavery, had been a Republican. But this all changed. The Republican Party had really switched their priorities away from helping African Americans, like the radical Republicans that we talked about in the Reconstruction era, and then times after that, where the Republicans and the Democrats, with their philosophies and their goals and what they're trying to help, the party switched, and when when President Roosevelt really began focusing the role of the government on helping the poorest of Americans, almost every African American in the nation was in that category, many of which were helped out by the New Deal. And so when he ran for re-election in 1936, 75% of the African American community ended up voting for him. What you can see here in this chart right here is really, it's a breakdown of in every election up to the 2004 election where African Americans have voted. You want to talk about some of the impact of the New Deal and some of the impact of Franklin Roosevelt. He congregated minority voting with the Democratic Party. In 1936, 71% of the African Americans, according to this, voted for the Democrat, and 28 voted for the Republican. And that number has shrunk over the years, as the Democratic Party has found strong support in minorities, and by helping them out and seeing to things that they need a lot more. This is all a result of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal policies. And even though he didn't do nearly as much as he could have or should have, he was doing something for African Americans, and they absolutely rewarded them. And that hasn't changed since then. Especially with this graph right here. It only goes to 2004, which is when President George W. Bush ran for re-election. Well, the next two elections are President Barack Obama, and he certainly garnered an enormous, overwhelming African-American vote. Those numbers even went up from the 88% in 2004. Now, President Roosevelt also gave other reasons for the support of African Americans. He had appointed several African Americans to high-ranking positions in government. The WPA, for example, had put more than 1 million African Americans to work in different jobs around the nation, and actually many in positions not requiring pure physical labor. Many were working as teachers and artists and different jobs out there that really gave them significant input. This is one of the most important women in our history. This is Franklin Roosevelt's wife. Her name is Eleanor. She was the First Lady of the United States. She was not bound by a lot of the political realities of being the president. And she was certainly somebody who reached out and helped those most in need. And for Eleanor Roosevelt, the idea of reaching out to African Americans and calling attention to their situation was a central part of who she was as a person, as she constantly found the people who needed the help the most and went to them and called attention to their problems and brought aid and brought assistance. And the more she learned about the lives of African Americans in the 1930s, the more she wanted to help them, and the more she actually got involved in there with their lives, and calling attention to segregation in the South and what life was like. For example, one of the most famous examples of this had to do with this woman right here. This is an African-American opera singer. Her name is Marian Anderson, and she was absolutely celebrated singer at her time. She was scheduled to be giving a concert at Constitution Hall in Virginia. But because she was black, she was barred from singing. It was a segregated facility. She was not allowed inside, even as a performer, simply due to the color of her skin. And she was barred from that concert. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt found out about it. And Eleanor Roosevelt arranged for her to give a concert, not at Constitutional Hall, but on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. 75,000 people showed up for the concert and sat around the reflecting pool at the Lincoln Memorial and listened to her sing. The entire thing was broadcast over the radio, and brought attention to the fact that, you know, this glorious voice that this woman had, and the only reason she wasn't allowed to give this concert was the color of her skin. You know, the president was restricted with sometimes with what he could do, but Eleanor Roosevelt, that's exactly where she found herself, was getting involved in those situations and mixing it up with those situations and bringing a lot of the same power of the White House with her that she just brought as first lady into these situations. And it was her that really began to push for civil rights in the 1930s. As other minorities like Mexican immigrants and Chinese and Japanese immigrants, certainly Native Americans, did not fare well during the Great Depression. Where in the 1920s, I'm sorry, had seen great improvements for women, the 1930s didn't see those improvements at all. As a matter of fact, women lost a lot of what they had gained in the 1920s, as men were still seen as the dominant breadwinners for a family. And so men were given priorities on all these jobs. And a woman who was working in a job was seen as taking a job away from a man who needed it to feed his family, regardless of her situation, regardless of what's going on in her home, or whether or not she has a husband to take care of her, has children, and the husband has simply left. None of that was really taken into consideration. And so minorities in all this time are really doing work. Eleanor Roosevelt really had her work cut out for her. Now, in 1936, Roosevelt was ready for re-election. And although he was attacked by men like Father Coughlin and conservatives who hated his New Deal ideas, Roosevelt wins in an absolute landslide because the people believed in him and what he was doing. He had really connected with the people in a way that few presidents had before or since. People believed he could and would solve their problems. And more than that, they believed that he was actually focused on solving their problems. With this re-election, he set out to really grab control and to really push his ideas. And he's going to let his anger with the Supreme Court, who periodically would find his ideas and his plans, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, unconstitutional and throw them out. He really got upset at that. Roosevelt decided he had Congress working with him. He had a Democratic-controlled Congress. Roosevelt was a Democrat, but the Republicans controlled the Supreme Court, and he couldn't get everything in there that he wanted to. He decided what he needed was more sympathetic members on the Supreme Court. And so he came up with a plan simply to start adding justices to the court until he reached a number of justices that agreed with him that he could constantly get all his ideas for the New Deal passed. This political cartoon here came out at that point in time. And it really kind of summed up that most Americans thought that at this point, Roosevelt had really, really overreached. That's Roosevelt there at the wheel, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, saying the compass doesn't point the way I want it to go, change it now. Well, the compass is the Supreme Court, and he wants Congress to give him the right to go ahead and pack the court, is what it became known as, by just adding all sorts of judges until he gets what he wants. But like I said, it certainly didn't work. And that one gets thrown out. But the court packing system is something that could certainly come up on the test, and you need to know what it is. Now, the New Deal lasted 5 years. Most of it came early on in a real whirlwind of acts passed between 1933 and 1935. Although it lifted the mood of the nation and really did get the nation moving again, it actually didn't do very much to fix the economy. World War II was going to do that. But the Great Depression, the New Deal, it had an impact, but it didn't really fix the economy. But several significant achievements came as a result of the New Deal, specifically Social Security. The Wagner Act, the role the government would now take as a source of relief for Americans in need. It attracted minorities to the Democratic Party who have not left it yet. But mostly it was just this sense of courage and optimism that he gave the nation, and this absolute belief that we're going to get through this, that Herbert Hoover was absolutely unable to convince the nation of. Roosevelt could do it. And with his actions and with what he did, the nation believed him. And really, people really began to believe that they have nothing to fear but fear itself. And that's important, because very frightening things were getting ready to happen. And the nation was certainly going to need a lot of faith and a lot of confidence to be able to deal with these things. That is the end of chapter 26. Thank you very much. I'm sorry it was really long. It was longer than I had anticipated. But to be perfectly honest with you, all we're doing is talking about the worst economic crisis in the nation's history, the reinvention of government to try and deal with it, and quite arguably the most significant figure in American history for the 20th century. So it's kind of a lot of information. Thank you very much.